Video on the cardiac cycle. One important thing to remember are these two terms. Systole means contraction, diastole means relaxation. Typically when we talk about systole, we're talking about ventricular systole, but we don't have to be talking about that because you may have maybe referring to the atria, but we would specify. But if it's not specified, then typically systole refers, or systole and diastole refer to the ventricles. All right, here is a very good diagram of what is going on in the cardiac cycle. So I'm just going to go ahead and go through the same graph that you have, and I'll try to hit all of the important parts. Okay, so here we go. All right, so we can, because it's a cycle, we could start at any point, but typically when we look at the cardiac cycle, we're in a time called mid to late diastole, which is part of ventricular filling. And so blood will be entering the ventricles at this point. But an important thing to know, if we look at this picture down here, is that blood is entering passively into the heart, and there is no contraction. You can see that all of the atria and the ventricles are completely relaxed chambers, and it's just the force of blood that has opened the atrioventricular valve, so the tricuspid mitral valve here, and blood is just flowing back into the heart. Then when we get to the end, so more like late diastole, is when we're going to get atrial contraction to force the rest of the blood. Oh, I didn't tell you, 70 to 80% of the blood will fill the heart, fill the ventricles during this time period. And if there were some problem where the atria could not contract, maybe because you were in AFib or something like that, that's okay. You still have 70% of the blood that's going to enter the heart, entering the heart, and the remaining 30% may not be forced down into the ventricles before ventricular contraction. But like I said, that's okay. I got 70% of my blood that's leaving my heart. So then to go back, no, I lost my spot. Anyway, I just wanted you to tell. Oh, okay. So ventricular contraction, atrial contraction is happening up here, right here at the end of ventricular filling, or the end of mid to late diastole. And so what is causing this ventricular contraction? Okay, well, let's take a look at what's going on. So here is, this first pink line is the pressure within the left atrium. It could be the right atrium, but we're going to do left atrium because that's the one that's going to pump the blood out of the heart. So we can see the pressure is pretty, it's just normal. It's not doing anything because the blood is just passively flowing into the heart. So right here at this point is when the atria contract, and so the pressure is going to rise up here. And what causes the atria to contract and the atria to go to depolarize? Well, it's the P wave. So we can see these two events happen simultaneously, and that's the thing that this graph is representing, is what simultaneous events are happening at different periods within the cardiac cycle, so that you know exactly at any one time what everything is doing within the heart. Okay, so atrial systole, so then it's going to relax, and then right at this point right here, the mitral valve is going to close. And so when that mitral valve closes, then you get a little recoil kind of thing with pressure, and then the pressure in the atria is just going to bottom out. Now, we can see a little bit more pressure happening inside the ventricle. So this blue line is the ventricle, not because the ventricle is contracted, but because of this surge of blood. So we get this last little bit of blood entering the heart, and here was the passive flow of blood. So this black line right here is ventricular volume, and so we have passive flow of blood to this point, then we get atrial systole, and then we get that last 20 to 30% of blood coming into the heart until we get to this point right here called EDV, which is end diastolic volume, the most blood that's going to return to the heart in this particular heartbeat. Okay, so if we go back to the electrocardiogram, so now we got nothing. The atria have depolarized, the ventricles haven't depolarized yet. And so the pressure is going to be greater right at this point in the ventricles as they start to contract. And so pressure is going to start to rise in the ventricles, and the pressure here is going to exceed atrial pressure. So right at this point where they cross is where the mitral valve is going to close. Now, if we look down here at this picture, okay, so here's this picture, here's the mitral valve that's closed, but notice that we also have the semilunar valve. So the aortic and pulmonary valves are also closed. So if we follow this pressure is building because the ventricles have depolarized and they are contracting. But there's this darker tan region in right here that we call isovolumetric phase. It's just this little narrow darker brown area. And what's happening here is that the ventricles have started to contract, so the pressure inside the ventricles is rising, but it has to get up here to exceed the pressure that is in the aorta. So this green line represents the pressure in the aorta. Well, we can see the pressure in the ventricle down here is like 20, and you have to build pressure until you can open up the semilunar valve, the aortic semilunar valve, and shoot the blood into the aorta. So you have to, this 60 millimeter of mercury difference in pressure is due to this contraction. Well, we shut the mitral valve right at this point right here, and we have yet to open the pulmonary semilunar, or the pulmonary semilunar, but aortic semilunar if we're on the left side of the heart. So this dark gray this darker tan area is called the isovolumetric contraction phase. So this is one of the two times where the ventricles are completely closed chambers. Now, why would we want that? Just besides the fact that the pressure has to climb, why not keep this valve open? Well, if you've ever tried to flush a leaky toilet, you know how unsatisfying that is. If water is still trying to enter your toilet tank and you try to flush it too early, it just kind of goes and stuff doesn't flush away. And for me, that's very unsatisfying. And it's very unsatisfying for your heart as well. We want to build a tremendous amount of pressure so that we can shoot the blood out of the ventricle. And we don't want the blood to just pour out of the ventricle. And so that's why we need to have this isovolumetric contraction phase to make sure that the pressure climbs high enough that it'll open the semilunar valve and push enough blood out into the aorta to get the blood flowing, that pressure high enough so that we can maintain flow all the way through our vasculature like we've talked about in another video. Okay, so because the ventricles are completely closed chambers right here, we are at EDV. So no more blood is entering, so we are at end diastolic volume for that heartbeat. Now, we closed the semilunar valves. So that is going to be this little squiggly line right here. That's the first heart sound. So when the AV valves close, that's the lub sound of the heart sounds. Okay, so I think that's good. So right here you can see, and it has the valves, so the atrioventricular valves, they're open till here and then they're closed. Aortic pulmonary valves, aortic and pulmonary valves, they're still closed until they open right here. All right, so now let's open up the semilunar valve, and because we're still pushing blood out, the ventricles are still contracting from the bottom up, we still get a rise in pressure. And that ventricular pressure is going to go up here to 120 millimeters of mercury. As that pressure is climbing, blood is leaving the heart. And so here we have our stroke volume is going to be this decline in blood volume. Stroke volume is usually about 70 milliliters. End diastolic volume is right around 120 milliliters, and systolic volume is about 50. So the difference in the two is stroke volume. So about 70 milliliters of blood is going to leave, and it's going to go out into the into the aorta. And so you can see, oh yeah, the aortic pressure is going to rise, and it's going to match that of the ventricle because of the pressure that the ventricle is exerting on the blood that's going out into the aorta. All right, so AV valves closed, semilunar valves open. We are now in 2B, which we refer to as the ventricular ejection phase. So blood is leaving the heart, and you can see it's going out either into the pulmonary trunk or it's going out into the aorta. Now, right here at this point, the ventricles are going to start to relax. How do we know? Oh, T wave. So we get ventricular repolarization, and repolarization is going to precede just briefly relaxation of the ventricle. And so as the ventricle begins to relax, the pressure is going to decrease, and it's going to decrease below the pressure that we see in the aorta. And because of the design of the semilunar valves that we have in the aorta, as the blood falls back, as pressure decreases due to the relaxation of the ventricles, as blood flows back, it's going to fill up the little cups of the semilunar valves, as you can see, little cuppy things right here, and that's going to push them shut. Now, as they push shut, the blood is going to rebound off of those and come back into the aorta and create what we call this dicrotic notch. So this is the decrease, this is the closing of the semilunar valves right here, and then this rise in pressure is the backflow of blood onto the semilunar valves, and now we're going to get the blood leaving the aorta, and then we're going to get that decline in pressure. So right at this point right here, the semilunar valves have closed, boom, right there, and now we're at ESV. Because the semilunar valves have closed, no more blood is going to leave the ventricle, but we also haven't produced enough pressure to exceed the pressure in the atria, because the atria are starting to fill right now with blood, but the atrial pressure isn't high enough to open up the semilunar or open up the AV valves yet. And so we have this time period in here, also this darker tan area, called isovolumetric relaxation. So you can see the AV valves are closed, the semilunar valves are closed, the blood's in the atria, and this ESV is down here in the ventricles, but no blood is coming into the ventricles, and so that's why we call it isovolumetric again. And then it's relaxation because the ventricles have relaxed. This is going to be early diastole because everybody has started to relax now, and then we're going to start ventricular filling all over again. So here's where the semilunar valves close, and then here is where the pressure in the aorta, the pressure in the atria, excuse me, is now higher than the pressure in the ventricles, and so now that's going to open the open the AV valves right at this point. Okay, boom, right there. So the mitral valve on the left, tricuspid valve on the right is going to open, and then blood. Ooh, look at that. There's the blood filling back into the ventricles again. And so we had this little bit of pressure here, which was enough to open up the mitral valve, and then it's going to decline, and then a little bit, and then it's going to rise as more blood fills the atria until the atria contract. And we're going to do the whole thing all over again. Oh, I didn't do this right here. So here is the second heart sound. This is the closing of the semilunar valve. So first heart sound, closing of the AV valve. Second heart sound, closing of the semilunar valve. Okay. That's a cardiac cycle. I love the cardiac cycle, you guys. Okay, so there's that. And, okay, so let's just quickly go over cardiac measurements. No, I have that somewhere else. So that, I'm going to end this video, and then we'll do regulation of cardiac output. No, I'm not going to end it yet. Sorry. Here you can read. Whoops. I went too far. No, I didn't. This was ventricular filling. Okay, so here are all the events that happen in ventricular filling. And then here is everything happening during ventricular systole. And then isovolumetric relaxation. And then we would start it all over again. How long does it last? About 0.8 of a second. The atria contract for about 1/10 of a second. That's why the AV valve holds on to the signal from the SA node for 1/10 of a second. Ventricular systole, it is about 0.3 of a second. So half of the time of a cardiac cycle from one heartbeat to another, your heart is relaxed, which is really kind of nice when you think about your heart never stops in your lifetime. So you think, oh, that poor muscle. No, half of the time your muscle is relaxed. Okay, it only, out of an entire second, it's only contracted 0.4 of a second. So it's kind of a nice thing to realize that your heart's okay, and under most conditions it shouldn't poop out on you. Okay, so now I'm going to get into cardiac output in the next video.